Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Andrew Ibarra, and in this video we're going to be creating and deploying policy sets using EPAC. Now it will be one of the longer videos, so I'll make sure I put the timestamps in the description down below. And from a conceptual perspective and from a technical perspective, this is one of the more complex ideas, not only through EPAC, but for Azure policy in general. So rather than jumping straight into the code itself, I actually want to review the core principles of policy sets. That way we understand what we're looking at when it comes to the EPAC template. So let's start off by reviewing the purpose of a policy set. If you watch the previous video, we have a custom definition or even a single definition as an example that we want to assign to a subscription or a scope. And this is typically a one-time assignment to that scope. But as you start having multiple policy definitions, you have to assign each definition multiple times individually. And there's multiple reasons why this isn't ideal. And just to make things simpler and have one-time assignments for all of your policy definitions, we introduced the concept of policy sets, also known as initiatives. So these initiatives are groupings of policy definitions, and they're typically to meet a certain goal or certain topic. As an example, maybe you might have a storage guardrails policy set, to where you might have a policy definition for HTTPS configurations, public network configurations, and tagging configurations in 3 separate policy definitions, but you group them together in what's known as a policy set or policy initiative. And when it's time to actually assign those to a scope, such as a subscription, it's back to a one-time assignment, which is more manageable and reduces overhead of having to multiply the amount of times you have to assign that policy your different scopes. Now, if we look at the core components of the policy sets, there's 5 key topics that we need to understand before we look at building a policy template for policy sets in EPAC. The first being the basic information, which for the most part is straightforward. It's the things like the display name, the description, and the metadata, such as the version or category. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a snapshot of an EPAC template for a policy set, where you can see that I gave the display name storage guardrails, just trying to keep it consistent with the example, as well as the description for enforced policies for storage accounts and some additional metadata. This is hopefully rather straightforward and pretty common against most policy resources and templates. As we move on from the basic information to the policies themselves, the way that we create them within the policy set is in a property called policyDefinitions, which is an array. So in this specific case, we're looking at 3 entries, going back to the example of one for enforce HTTPS, one for public networking, and the last one for tagging. Now, what I will say, the way that we group them or the way that we identify which policies we want to use is by this subproperty for each of them called policy definition name. And depending if you use a custom policy, in the previous example, you'll recognize this as the name that we gave that custom definition that would go here for the value. Or if you're referencing a built-in policy, and let me show you on this other screen, if you're looking at a built-in policy, such as allowed locations, that definition name will be this GUID that's present here. So it would be the last trailing identifier for the policy definition that you're trying to reference. And if we take a look back at the example from the screenshot, the reason we do this is to avoid maybe giving display names that have multiple display names across different policies, and always that identifier will be unique. So the way that we always keep it within enterprise policies code within the policy sets is you have a policy definition name, which is hopefully a unique identifier for each one that you want to include. And then you have the policy definition reference ID, which should be a human readable name. And there's multiple reasons why it's best practice to keep it human readable, where in some scenarios you might only be able to identify the policy based on that reference ID. So just to keep it best practice, I try to map the reference IDs to the main purpose of the policy definition. And especially in this case, when you're just looking at the code snippet here, it's difficult to understand what this GUID is, for example, without somebody giving a proper reference ID that alludes and helps identify what this reference or what this GUID is. And then we move on to the policy parameters. So each of the different built-in policies that I'm referencing have their own parameters in each individual definition. So if you want to reference those parameters when you're putting the policy set together, it does have enablement to add a parameter section for each of these different policies that I'm including in my policy set. And you can see in this first one, in the parameter section, there's a parameter that's called effect, and I set the value to audit. Same thing for public networking, and also same thing for tagging. But what you'll notice in the tagging built-in policy, there's an additional parameter called tag name, and I want to set that value to production in this case. So if you didn't have this parameter section, what would end up happening is whatever the default values are for these individual policies would get set automatically. And if there isn't a default, but it's required, you will more than likely get an error to which you will need to come back and add the parameters into this policy set. Keep in mind, if you do it like this, the way that policy sets work is if you hard code the values, that is set in stone when it's time to assign this policy set to your subscription. So let's say I don't want it to be audit, or I want to change the tag when it's time to assign it to a subscription or a different subscription. You have to come back and update the policy set itself if you're going to be hard coding it like you're seeing here on the screenshot. And this is where we introduce the concept of initiative parameters. So if you want to modify the parameter value when it's time to assign the policy, let's say, for example, I have the tagging policy, and then when I'm assigning it to my production subscription, I want the tag value to be production. And when I assign it to my dev environment, I want that tag value to be dev. In order to do this, you have to use initiative parameters, and you essentially parameterize your own parameters. And this is a concept that's not specific to EPAC. This is an Azure policy set concept that when it's time to assign this policy set, rather than having them hard-coded, we're going to set them as a parameter. And now you have a parameter section that exists above or below your policy definition section that you get to declare. So for example, what you're ending up seeing here is I have a parameter section, and in the parameter section, I give it a tag name as a parameter. And rather than hard coding it in my definition, I set the value here and I point it to my tagging definition that I'm referencing in my policy set. That way, when it's time to assign my policy, I actually have more flexibility to update this value during the assignments phase. And it'll make a little bit more sense once we actually do the assignment itself. But just keep in mind, if you want that flexibility when it's time to assign it, you have to create a parameter section and parameterize your parameter in your policy definition. The other thing I want to call out is I also have the parameters for effect parameterize in the parameter section. And by doing this, because they're all the same parameter it's referencing, the effect for all of these will be controlled by a single parameter. Meaning if I wanted the HTTPS one to be audit and maybe the public networking one to be deny, you need to create individual parameters for each of these individual policy definitions. And again, I told you that these concepts can be very confusing, so hopefully this makes sense or inches you towards understanding how the parameters work with policy sets. But again, we're going to walk through building this out manually in the next minute or so. And the last concept is groups. So if you want a grouping inside of your policy set, you can leverage something called policy definition groups, to where likewise you can have a parameter or property, more specifically a property that exists outside of your policy definitions. You create definition groups. So maybe you might have a grouping for networking and maybe another one for tagging. And in your policy definitions, when you're setting these in your policy set, you can link it to groups. So for example, my enforced HTTPS and my block public network are both set to the group networking, and the one for tagging is set to the group tagging. This isn't absolutely necessary, but as you're maybe creating a policy set that has 50, 100, 200 definitions, whatever the case might be, it does help to have policy definitions group just so that you can group them a little bit cleaner. And from a UI perspective, when you go to the Azure portal to see the compliance data, if you notice here on this left-hand side, this is an example of a screenshot of a policy set that's assigned that doesn't use grouping. And you'll notice it immediately jumps into policies compared to the one that uses grouping, where you'll have an additional tab now that you can have like an additional filter to just show me the groups that belong to networking, or show me the policies that belong to the group networking more specifically, or maybe the ones that belong to tagging. Again, it's not absolutely necessary, but it does help as far as organization goes. Okay, with that being said, let's jump to building a policy set through our EPAC folder structure. So let me pull this up and switch screens. The place we go to set the policy set is going to be in policy set definitions. I'm going to create a new policy here called storage-guardrails.jsonc. And the best place to go to grab this is on our website for a template. So I'll go to our documentation page, go to define policy resources. Once this loads, go to policy set definitions, and here will be a quick and easy template for you to copy and start building out your custom policy set definition here. Just format this to clean this up. And everything in the property section here, I went through within this beginning of this video. But again, just to cover the two functionality pieces that are required for policy sets, the schema on line 2 helps reference to a file that we have published on our GitHub site, that as you're building out this policy set manually, if you start doing things incorrectly, or maybe things are misconfigured, you'll be able to get warnings ahead of time, and it's based off the schema. So it's typically best to keep line 2 there. And on line 3, we have the name. And again, very similar to the policy definition name, when it's time to reference this anywhere, like let's say we're going to reference this policy set in an assignment, we have to make sure we give this name something unique, that it doesn't interact with another policy set or cause a conflict because another policy set has the same name. So if we're doing things through EPAC and it's custom, we can definitely give it a unique name, as long as we ensure that it's unique and won't have any conflicting errors. But for me, I'm going to go ahead and use a new GUID just to ensure that this is 100% unique. So I'll go ahead and paste this here. And now let's go through building this out together. So on line 5, display name, I'm going to be giving this one storage guardrails, just like in my example. And for the description, I'll just name this storage guardrails for my production environment. And I'll update the display name to be EPAC, just so that it sticks out a little bit more when we go to check this in the portal. Metadata for version, we can keep that there. And for category, I can name this storage, just to have it simpler. Now we jump into the parameter section. And again, the parameter section is for the initiative, if we're going to parameterize our parameters. So I'm going to skip over this just for now. Let's go ahead and start using the policy definitions property and actually reference some built-in policy definitions. And the best way to do that is to go to the Azure portal or go to the AzAdvertizer site, which I'll show here in a couple minutes, and find a definition that you want to deploy. So for me, I know specifically I want to deploy, let's say I want to go with secure transfer. This is the HTTPS one for storage. And let's say I want to do this one, secure transfer to storage account should be enabled. I'll copy this definition ID GUID and go back to my code and paste it here for the definition name. And again, the reference ID, you want to have it very similar to what the intention of this policy is. So let's say it's the, what is it, the HTTPS? So I'll say enforce.https. And does this have any parameters that we want to update? Let's go ahead and check that inside of this single definition. So if I'm looking at the code for this specific definition that we're referencing in the parameter section, there's only one that's here. It's effect, and the default value is audit, but maybe we want to set that to deny. So the best way to do that is to go back to the policy definitions, go to parameters. First parameter, the only parameter for us is this one, We're going to replace this with effect because that's the name that we're trying to update. And rather than hard coding the effect to be set to deny, let's go ahead and use one of the parameters up here. And again, I like to make sure that my parameters are unique. So rather than sharing the effects to both of these different definitions here, I'm going to be creating an effect parameter specifically for my enforce HTTPS. So I'll rename this first one to enforce HTTPS-effect. The type is string, and the default value for me, I want it to be deny. And I'll take this parameter and I'll replace it with this right here. So this is good to go. This is ready. It matches perfectly with what we need and what EPAC needs in order to successfully build this out. So I gave it a reference ID of enforce HTTPS. I gave it the built-in GUID for the definition name. I checked that the only parameter that I can add is called effect. And then I set the value of this. I parameterize it up top in the parameter section, and I set the default value to deny. Let's go ahead and do one more and go back to the Azure portal. Maybe let's find a tagging policy. I don't know if tagging is the best thing to search. Go with just tag. Go inherit a tag from the subscription if missing. And let's copy this GUID. Go back to our code, replace the definition name here. And the name of this policy was inherit a tag from subscription. Doesn't necessarily need to have spaces or hyphens, but I typically prefer having a dash here for code readability perspectives. And then the parameters that we can add to this specific policy, let's see, there's only one, which is tag name. It looks like the effect is hard-coded to modify. So let's go ahead and grab tag name and paste it here for the name of the value. And up here, we're going to name this, probably do it like this, to where I do inherit a tag from subscription, dash tag name, just to make sure that this one's unique, just in case in the future there's additional policies that have tag names. I'll set this to, this is a string, so double check inside of the portal what this one was. This is type string, and I'll set the default value to production. Awesome. And then just replace this value with this down here. So this is good to go. We have a policy set now that we created called storage guardrails. We have two policies that are part of this policy definition, one for enforce HTTPS and one for inherit a tag from subscription. They both reference to built-in policies. And actually, just to piggyback from what we did on our previous video, let's go ahead and add one more, one of the custom policies that we built on the previous video. I'm going to copy this section and add a third one. And now for the definition name, let's go ahead and find where our custom policy is, this EPAC allowed locations. I'll take this name property that we had from here and now use it in the storage guardrails where the definition name is here. And this one is for allowed locations. And the parameter that's inside of this is list of allowed locations, as we see here. So I'll go ahead and replace the parameter name here. And let's go ahead and create a new parameter up top. So copy one that already exists, paste. I like to keep the names consistent with the name of the reference ID. So I'll do this. And list of allowed locations. I believe this is an array, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's an array. And we can give it a blank array for the time being. So let's go ahead and just set this instead of a string, or this needs to remain a string, but we're going to go ahead and give this a default value of a blank array there. So now we have this And we're going to go ahead and put this down here for the parameter value. And this should be ready to go. So just to recap exactly where we're at, we set the display name, description, and everything for our policy set. We give a unique identifier just in case we want to reference this in an assignment in the future. We updated the policy definitions to have 2 built-in policies here for inherit attack from subscription and force HTTPS. And also we use a custom EPAC definition that's in our folder structure on the 3rd entry of our policy set, and we gave it a reference ID of allowed locations. And for each of these, we parameterize them up top. Now, I didn't add groups, but let's go ahead and do that now just so that we understand how it works technically by building it through the EPAC template for policy sets. So outside of policy definitions, let's add a new property called policy definition groups. And let's go ahead and give the first entry, set the name to name this one networking again. And let's go ahead and copy and paste this to create a new group. And we'll name this one general. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect for the example, but just to conceptually understand how this works through the code snippet. And then up here for each of these different policy definitions, I'm going to go ahead and create an entry for group names. And let's say for this one, I want it to be networking. And for the other ones, I want them to be general. Doing one last spot check, I did notice that the allowed locations type for this parameter is string, and this should be array. So let's go ahead and save this. Everything else looks good. I'll close it. And the command to build the deployment plan is build-deploymentplans. And this will go ahead and do the delta to at least notice that there's a new policy set that I want to deploy, and hopefully output that plan that we will end up deploying in the next step. And while this is running, in the meantime, I want to check the Azure policy page for the policy definitions tab and confirm that there currently doesn't exist an EPAC-storage guardrails policy, which for now, no policy found at the given scope, and I am at the tenant root group. So let's go back to the output and wait for this to complete. All right, so this completed, and we can tell that in the output for the summary analysis that the policy set definition shows 1 total change, that 1 change being 1 new. And as expected, we have an output file that was generated for the policy plan. If you scroll up, we can tell that in the processing section for the policy sets, it did find that 1 new policy set or EPAC-storage guardrails. Looks good. We're going to go ahead and run the command to actually now deploy this policy set into our Azure environment. And the command for that is Deploy-PolicyPlan. And this typically takes a few seconds, especially if it's only 1 or 2 policy sets. Looks like it was good and succeeded, able to deploy that policy set into our environment. Let's go ahead and quickly refresh this page, and hopefully it's already there. It does take a few seconds, typically 5 to 10, 15 seconds on the long side for it to generate inside of the Azure portal. So here it is. It popped up, EPAC-storage guardrails. You can tell it's a custom policy set with 3 policies. If we click into it, we can see the 3 individual policies that we placed here. 2 of them being those built-in policies, and the bottom one being the custom policy that we created through EPAC on the previous video. And likewise, I want to call out the reference IDs here for each of these. They're human readable. They help you understand the intention of these. So everything checks out, looks very good. We can also see that we have 2 parameters, not 2 parameters, 2 groups that are part of this policy set, and 3 parameters that we ended up declaring in our policy set, that when it's time to actually assign this, we can change those values organically depending on the scope that we're trying to assign these policy sets to. All right, now before we wrap up, I want to quickly show the fast way to export pre-built policy sets through the AzAdvertizer website. So if we go to azadvertizer.net, again, this is built by a Microsoft employee named Julian Hayward. This is a vast library that has all built-in and community policies and policy sets. And for us, I want to go to initiatives at the top. And this has a pre-built library of, again, all the built-in policy sets, as well as any custom or ALZ-driven policies. So for us, just to keep things simple, I want to go with the sandbox policy set that is already pre-made for us here. Click into it. What I want to call out is at the very bottom, you'll have a copy for EPAC button that will automatically take this policy set and put it into EPAC notation for you. Let's go ahead and go back to our policy set definitions. We'll go ahead and name this one sandbox.jsonc and paste the contents here. I do want to call one thing out when you're doing things like this, when you're copying policy sets from the AzAdvertizer site. There might be a chance, depending on the policy that you're trying to create. In this case, this one is a custom ALZ policy. And if you notice that the policy types, it includes two policies. One of the policies is built-in, and the other policy is an ALZ policy, which is another custom policy. So in order for this to successfully get deployed inside of our Azure environment and to get stored as a policy set in our tenants, we need to also include this ALZ custom definition. And if we're looking at the policies used table here, the built-in policy is the bottom one for not allowed resources, and the custom one is this top one for deny VNet peering cross subscription. Let's go ahead and also copy this definition, the single definition, and put it into our folder structure. I'm going to hit copy definition for EPAC. Go back to here, go to policy definitions, paste. I believe this one was VNet subscription.jsonc and paste. And what you'll notice is it automatically comes created with the name set to what the policy uses. So if I save this and go back to my sandbox one, it's the name that it references is already part of the one that's part of AzAdvertizer. So just giving you a little bit of a heads up, if you're going to be extracting any of the policy sets that are on the website and it's a custom policy set, just ensure that it's not using any policy definitions that are also custom, because if it is, you also have to include it in your definition structure. And let's go ahead and save this, close it, and run the build deployment plans. All right, so this completed, and we can see here, because we're adding a new policy set that's picked up by EPAC, and also the custom policy definition that's part of that policy set was also picked up by EPAC. And we can also tell, if we scroll up a little bit, we can see for processing policy definitions, the deny VNet peering is there, as well as the enforce policies in the sandbox landing zone. Let's go ahead and deploy this with the Deploy-PolicyPlan and visit the Azure policy page, find the definitions, and I believe I copied it. It's this one, enforce policies in the sandbox landing zone. Again, we'll give it about 5 to 10 seconds for this to update. And there it is. So custom policy, two policies. Inside of it, we have the not allowed resource types and the deny VNet peering for cross subscriptions, which aligns with the policy set that we grabbed from the AzAdvertizer site. So hopefully this helped. I apologize, this was one of the longer videos, but it is probably up there as far as, if not number one, of the more complicated and technical videos when it comes to creating policy resources through EPAC. In the next video, we're going to be taking both the policy sets and policy definitions, built-in and custom, and actually assigning them to a subscription or a management group so that we can start gathering compliance data. If there's anything in the meantime that you'd like to see or anything that I missed in this video, please leave a comment down below. I've been looking at them and providing some feedback. I appreciate everybody, chiming in. We're definitely trying to better enable the community. So any questions or anything that you'd like to see, please let us know in the comments down below. Thank you. See you in the next video.